Okay, so picture this. You're at a dinner party, and the conversation turns to, those topics that everyone has an opinion on,
Ugh.
like ESP,
Yeah.
extrasensory perception.
Sure.
And you've got Harry on one side of the table, red-faced, practically yelling, ESP. Come on, that's just wishful thinking. It's nonsense. If science can't prove it, it's not real.
Yeah.
Classic skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
And then across from him, you have Shirley, calm as can be, just sipping her wine, and she's like, well, maybe you just haven't considered all the possibilities.
That's a great way to set the stage, because what you've done there is you've illustrated this sort of fundamental tension that we're going to be exploring in this deep dive today.
Exactly. Because we're going to be delving into a topic that's both intriguing and controversial, psychic phenomena from a scientific perspective.
Yes.
And this deep dive is really for you, our listener, because you're the kind of person who likes to think outside the box.
Yeah.
You're curious about ideas that challenge conventional wisdom,
Yeah.
and you want to understand the evidence.
Exactly.
So we're going to be looking at this fascinating book, The Conscious Universe, by Dean Radin, which you recommended.
Yeah.
And it's packed with research spanning over a century. So we're going to try to distill the key takeaways, make it clear and accessible, even if you're not familiar with all the scientific jargon.
Absolutely.
But before we get into the specifics, I think it's important to define what we're actually talking about. What exactly is psi-I? Because it's often lumped together with all sorts of paranormal claims.
Right, and that's where Radin is very careful in how he approaches the definition. He wants to distinguish psi from that broader, often kind of sensationalized term paranormal.
Right.
So think of psi as really referring to anomalies and information transfer effects that we just can't explain based on what we currently understand about how our senses work or our motor abilities.
So things like telepathy.
Exactly. Telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition,
Right.
these are all considered psi phenomena, and the key is that they're being studied through rigorous scientific methods.
Right, so it's not just like ghost stories or,
No, it's really an attempt to apply scientific rigor to these experiences.
Okay, so then we run into this concept of the supernatural, right? Like, if it's psychic, does that automatically mean it's beyond the natural world?
That's a really good point, and it's worth remembering that what we consider supernatural has changed dramatically over time.
Yeah.
Things that were once attributed to supernatural forces we now understand through science. Like the weather or disease.
Yeah.
I really like this quote from the astronaut Edgar Mitchell. He said, "What we call unnatural or supernatural is simply a very large gap in our knowledge of what is natural, particularly regarding relatively rare occurrences." So maybe psi is on the edge of what we currently understand scientifically, but with further research, it could become something we see as perfectly natural.
Yeah, that's a really cool way to think about it. Like, it's not necessarily defying the laws of nature. Maybe we just haven't figured out the laws yet.
Yeah, exactly.
So what drives scientists to even investigate something like psi-psi? I mean, it's pretty controversial, right?
Well, often the starting point is those really compelling real-life anecdotes, the personal experiences that people report.
Yeah.
Like, let's say someone has a vivid dream about a distant relative who's in trouble, and then the next day they get news that something did actually happen to that person. These types of stories, while they're not scientific proof in themselves, they spark that curiosity. They raise the question of, could this be more than just coincidence? And that's what leads scientists to design experiments to see if they can replicate these experiences under controlled conditions.
Right, so it's those personal stories that plant the seed, but then science comes in and tries to see if there's actually something measurable there.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting.
But then you've got the human element, right? Scientists are people too. They have their own biases and beliefs.
Yeah.
How do you ensure objectivity when dealing with something like psi that already has so much baggage?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge, and Radin talks about this a lot. He points out that evaluating scientific claims isn't always this purely objective process. There's a human element involved, and scientists, like everyone else, can get really attached to their beliefs, and those beliefs can act like filters, making it difficult to objectively assess evidence that doesn't fit their worldview.
So it's like we all have these mental blind spots.
Yeah, and science in practice is a process of evolving theories, not always just cold, hard logic.
Right, it's messy.
It is.
And with psi-psi, it feels like there's been a lot of skepticism, even outright hostility from some corners of the scientific community.
There has been, and Radin actually points to a specific group, a relatively small but influential group of very skeptical philosophers and scientists who have actively tried to suppress or even ridicule psi research for over a century.
Wow, for over a century.
Yeah, and this raises a really important question. Were all those scientists who reported positive psi findings just delusional or incompetent? Or is there something else going on here? Is there something within the scientific community itself that makes it resistant to certain types of evidence?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it makes you think about the sociology of science.
Yeah.
How group dynamics and power structures can influence what gets accepted as knowledge.
Exactly.
And of course, one of the cornerstones of good science is replication, right?
Yeah.
If you can't repeat an experiment and get similar results, the original findings become a lot less convincing.
Absolutely. Replication is crucial. And Radin makes a really helpful analogy. He compares it to judging the skill of a baseball player like Mickey Mantle.
Okay.
We wouldn't evaluate Mantle's ability based on a single lucky hit in one game. We look at his long-term batting average, his performance over thousands of at-bats in games.
Right. Consistency over time.
Exactly. And in the same way, one isolated positive finding in psi research isn't enough. What we're looking for is consistent positive results across many independent experiments.
So has psi research actually been replicated? Because one of the criticisms you often hear is that it's all based on these isolated one-off studies that can't be reproduced.
That's a common misconception that Radin addresses specifically.
Yeah.
He talks about this lone wolf criticism, and he uses the example of Robert John's research on mind-matter interaction at Princeton.
Okay.
John's work has actually been replicated by over 70 other researchers worldwide, both before and after his main research period.
70. That's a lot.
It is. So it's not just one guy in a lab getting lucky. It's a whole body of research.
So why does this idea of isolated findings persist then?
Well, Radin suggests that there are a couple of psychological factors at play. One is what's called confirmation bias. People who are already skeptical of psi are more likely to find reasons to dismiss positive replications. They'll focus on any potential flaws in the methodology, no matter how small.
So it's like they're looking for reasons to say, I told you so.
Yeah, exactly. And the other factor is just the human tendency to resist changing our beliefs.
Yeah.
Even when presented with evidence that contradicts what we think we know, our minds are really good at finding ways to explain it away.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that.
Yeah.
You get into an argument with someone, and no matter how many facts you throw at them, they just won't budge.
Right, their minds are made up.
And you mentioned an example of this in the book with a researcher who actually got positive results but then dismissed his own findings.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story. It was Professor John E. Coover at Stanford University. He conducted some of the earliest rigorous ESP card tests back in the early 1900s.
Okay.
And he actually got statistically significant hit rates higher than what you'd expect by chance alone.
Wow.
But because he was so convinced that EST was impossible, he just couldn't accept his own data. He looked at the evidence that suggested there might be something real there and concluded that there was nothing.
That's incredible. It's like the evidence was staring him in the face, but his belief system was so strong it wouldn't let him see it.
Exactly. It really highlights the power of our preconceptions.
So even if we do see replication in psi research, does that mean every single experiment has to be 100% successful? Like, does every person who claims to have psychic abilities have to perform perfectly every time?
That's a good question. And Radin argues that expecting perfect results all the time is just unrealistic, especially when dealing with phenomena that likely involve complex human factors, like psi.
Right.
He uses the baseball analogy again.
Yeah.
Even the best hitters don't get a hit every time they're at bat. So we shouldn't necessarily expect individuals who might have psi abilities to perform flawlessly in every single trial.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The key is to look at the overall trends, the statistical significance across a body of research.
Right. Not just cherry pick the individual cases that fit your narrative.
Exactly.
And that brings us to meta-analysis.
Right.
Which sounds like a way to get a bigger picture view of the research.
It is. Meta-analysis is essentially the analysis of analyses. It's a statistical technique that allows researchers to combine the results from multiple independent studies that are all looking at the same question.
Okay.
So instead of just looking at one baseball game, you're looking at the player's entire career stats to get a more accurate assessment of their skill.
Right. So it gives you more confidence in the findings.
It does. And Radin actually quotes someone saying that meta-analysis could revolutionize how science has handled data and become the way many arguments will be ended.
Wow. So it's a pretty powerful tool.
It is. And it's been incredibly valuable in psi research.
Can you give an example of how it's been used?
Sure. Radin talks about the dream telepathy experiments.
Okay.
If you look at individual dream telepathy studies, many of them did show hit rates above what you'd expect by chance.
Which is good, right?
Yeah, those are considered positive outcomes. But a lot of those individual studies also had confidence intervals that included the chance level. meaning we couldn't be absolutely certain that the results weren't just due to random fluctuations.
So it's like a maybe.
Yeah, kind of. But here's where meta-analysis comes in. When researchers combine the results from many Gansfeld experiments.
Can you remind me what a Gansfeld experiment is?
Sure, it's a type of experiment where they try to reduce sensory input to the receiver. So they'll put them in a comfortable chair, maybe cover their eyes with halved ping pong balls, put headphones on them with white noise playing, just to kind of create this state of mild sensory deprivation.
Yeah.
And then in a separate location, the sender focuses their attention on a target image or a video clip.
Right.
And the receiver tries to describe what they're experiencing mentally.
Right.
And then afterwards, they're shown the target along with some decoys and asked to pick which one best matches what they saw in their mind.
Okay, so if they're just guessing, what are the chances of picking the right target?
With 4 targets, it's 25%.
Okay, so if the hit rates are consistently above 25%, that suggests something more than chance is going on, and that's what the meta-analysis showed.
Yes. When they combined the results from all those Gansfeld experiments, the statistical odds against chance were 10 billion to 1.
10 billion to 1. That's huge.
It is. That's a level of statistical significance that you rarely see in psychology. And it was so compelling that even some of the biggest skeptics in the field, like Ray Hyman and Charles Honorton, they had to admit that something interesting was happening.
Wow. So even the skeptics were convinced.
Well, convinced that something was going on that needed further investigation.
Right. So it wasn't just chance or flawed methodology.
Exactly.
But I'm sure the skeptics still had some explanations up their sleeves. What were some of the criticisms they raised about the Gansfeld experiments?
The main ones were sensory leakage and randomization flaws.
Okay, what does that mean?
Sensory leakage means that maybe some unintentional cues were getting through to the receiver despite the sensory reduction.
Like maybe the experimenter knew the target and accidentally gave it away with their body language or tone of voice?
Yeah, something like that. And randomization flaws refer to potential problems with how the targets were selected and presented. Like if there was a pattern to the randomization, the receiver might unconsciously pick up on it.
Right. So these were valid concerns?
They were. But Radin points out that the overall body of evidence, particularly from the meta-analyses, doesn't really support these criticisms as the main explanation for the positive results.
Okay.
For example, one study that was actually designed to have a potential sensory leakage flaw ended up showing results slightly below chance.
Interesting.
And regarding randomization, there was some debate about how significant those flaws were in earlier studies, but most researchers agree that they can't account for the strong overall effects seen across the Gansfeld research.
Okay, so it seems like there's something more going on than just chance or methodological errors.
That's what the evidence suggests.
But then there's the argument that even if a psi effect exists, it's so tiny, so weak, that it's practically meaningless.
Right, that's the argument about effect size. Some skeptics say, okay, maybe there's a statistically significant effect, but it's so small, who cares?
So it's like saying, yeah, maybe you can move that feather with your mind, but you can't lift a car. So what's the point?
Kind of. But Radin argues that any reliable demonstration of a genuine psi effect is important.
Okay.
Just because an effect might seem small at our current level of understanding doesn't mean it's not significant. It could be that we just haven't developed the right tools or theories to fully grasp its implications.
Right.
He compares it to the early discoveries in electricity. The initial effects were probably pretty subtle, small sparks and currents, but look at the impact electricity has had on our world.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes the most groundbreaking discoveries start with these seemingly insignificant observations.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier the real-life anecdotes that often inspire this research. Do you have a particular example that really illustrates that personal drive to understand these experiences?
Yeah, Radin tells this really moving story about a friend of his who had a recurring dream about his son being very sick. In the dream, the son was calling out for his father on a specific night in March. The next day, the father got a letter with recent photos of his son, and it mentioned that the son had a mild fever but was recovering.
Yeah.
But a month later, another letter arrived with the news that the son had actually died from a sudden relapse of the fever. And it turned out he died on that same night in March that the father had the dream.
Wow.
And right before he died, the son had been calling out for his father just like in the dream.
That's chilling.
It is.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until friends reminded the father about the dream and its timing that he even realized the connection to the actual date of his son's death.
So it's like a premonition.
It seems that way. And these kinds of deeply personal, seemingly precognitive experiences, they really fuel the desire to understand if there's something more to them than just coincidence.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a powerful motivator. Now, are there any other issues within the research itself that could skew the results? I remember reading about something called the file drawer problem.
Yeah, the file drawer problem is a big concern in all areas of science, not just sci-psych.
Okay, what is it?
It refers to the tendency for studies that get negative or non-significant results to just never get published.
Oh, so they end up hidden away in a file drawer somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And this can create a bias in the published literature because it makes it seem like an effect is stronger or more consistent than it really is.
Right, because we're only seeing the positive results.
Exactly.
So how do you account for that?
Well, researchers have developed statistical methods to estimate how many unpublished negative studies would be needed to completely wipe out the significant findings in a particular area of research.
Okay.
Radin gives the example of those rigorously controlled ESP card studies from the 1930s. He says they estimated that you'd need a whopping 29,000 unpublished, unsuccessful studies to bring those results down to a non-significant level.
29,000, that seems unlikely.
It does. It would mean that there were 861 unpublished studies for every one that was published, which just doesn't seem plausible.
So it seems like the file drawer problem, while it's a valid concern, probably isn't enough to explain away all the positive findings in psi research.
That's what the evidence suggests.
And what about the government? Had there been any official investigations into psi?
Radin does mention the SAIC studies on remote viewing. SAIC Applications International Corporation.
Right.
They were a private company, but they conducted research for the government.
Okay.
And these remote viewing studies were actually pretty rigorous. They had a committee of prominent scientists overseeing the research, even a Nobel laureate in physics.
Wow, they were taking it seriously.
They were.
Yeah.
And interestingly, after some earlier remote viewing studies at SRI convinced the government sponsors that something real was going on, the later SAI experiments focused more on trying to understand how psi perception works rather than just proving that it exists.
So they were moving beyond just trying to establish whether it was real and into the realm of, okay, so how does this thing actually work?
Exactly.
Remote viewing is fascinating. The idea of perceiving distant places or events without using your normal senses. Does the research distinguish between different types of sci-fi, like telepathy and clairvoyance?
Yeah, researchers do try to differentiate between those terms, even though in everyday language we often use them interchangeably.
Right.
So telepathy would be specifically mind-to-mind communication.
Okay.
And clairvoyance would be perceiving information about distant objects or events in space or time, but without another person sending that information.
Okay, so it's like you're picking up on the information directly from the environment somehow.
Right. And Radin points out that the experimental evidence doesn't really prove the existence of pure telepathy or real-time clairvoyance as separate, distinct phenomena.
Interesting.
Instead, a lot of the evidence, both anecdotal and empirical, could be explained by various forms of precognition.
Precognition. That's seeing the future, right?
Yeah, the ability to perceive future events.
Okay, now that one really bends my mind. How can you possibly see something before it happens?
It's definitely a challenge to our understanding of time, but Radin offers a pretty straightforward way of thinking about it.
Okay.
He suggests that we might occasionally be bumping into our own future.
Bumping into our own future.
Yeah. His argument is that the only way we know if a seemingly psychic hunch or impression was accurate is if it's later confirmed by actual events.
Okay, so it's like we're getting glimpses of what's to come, but we
Right.
don't necessarily know it's the future until it actually happens.
Right.
That's an interesting way to frame it. Are there any physiological indicators that might support this idea of precognition?
There is some research in that area. Radin discusses studies that looked at physiological responses to future emotional stimuli.
Okay.
For example, research on electrodermal activity.
Electrodermal activity.
That's changes in the electrical conductivity of your skin, which can be a measure of emotional arousal. And they found that people showed these unconscious physiological responses before being shown emotionally charged images compared to neutral images.
Wow, so it's like their bodies were reacting to something that hadn't even happened yet consciously.
Right. And he also mentions a study at the University of Iowa where people were playing a card game, and they showed physiological responses that seemed to anticipate whether they were about to draw a winning or losing card before they even saw the card.
That's amazing. It's like
Right.
our bodies might have some subtle awareness of events that are still in the future.
It's a fascinating possibility.
Now, what about mind-matter interaction or psychokinesis? That's another area that's often associated with psychic phenomena.
Yes, PK or psychokinesis is the idea that your mind can directly influence physical systems without any known physical means.
Like moving objects with your mind.
Exactly. And Radin notes that while there are some theoretical discussions about this in mainstream physics, actual reports of experiments demonstrating macroscopic PK effects in physics journals are pretty rare.
Okay, so not a lot of scientists are bending spoons in the lab.
Not exactly, but sci-fi researchers have done a lot of work in this area.
What kind of work?
Well, a lot of it focuses on something called micropsychokinesis using random number generators, or RNGs.
RNGs, what are those?
They're electronic devices that produce streams of random numbers based on quantum events.
Yeah.
So their output is supposed to be completely unpredictable.
Okay.
And the idea is that if the mind can influence the physical world, even in a subtle way, people might be able to mentally bias the output of these random generators.
Okay, so it's like trying to make the RNG produce more ones than zeros or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But why focus on these tiny random systems instead of trying to levitate a table or something more dramatic?
Radin gives 4 main reasons for that. First, consistently reproducible large-scale PK effects on stable objects in a lab setting are incredibly rare.
Okay.
Second, even things that seem stable at a macroscopic level have random fluctuations going on at the microscopic level.
Right.
So even if you could influence a table with your mind, you'd still need statistical analysis to detect the effect. Third, historically, the research in this area evolved from experiments with dice, not from trying to do these big showy effects.
Okay.
And fourth, there's a psychological element to it. It seems intuitively easier to influence a random system because its behavior is defined by these tiny events rather than a big, obvious violation of physical laws.
So it's like it feels more achievable to nudge a random system in a certain direction.
Yeah, exactly.
So what have the meta-analyses of these RNG studies shown?
They've shown some pretty impressive results, often with odds against chance that are astronomical again.
Okay.
Radin mentions one meta-analysis that estimated you'd need 54,000 unreported RNG studies with null results to make the observed psi effect go away.
54,000. That's a lot of missing studies.
It is, and it's 90 times the number of studies that were actually reported.
So it seems unlikely that the file drawer problem could account for all of that.
Right. And he also highlights the findings from the Princeton Tier Lab, which collected a huge database of RNG experiments over decades and consistently found statistically significant positive results.
So it seems like there's a real effect there, even if it's subtle.
That's what the research suggests.
What about the idea of influencing living organisms from a distance? Has there been any research on that?
Yes, there have been experiments looking at distant mental influence on human physiology.
Okay, how do they do that?
Well, one way is to measure electrodermal activity in a receiver who's in one room, while a sender in another room tries to mentally influence them to either become more aroused or more calm.
Okay.
And Radin presents a meta-analysis of these studies, which shows pretty consistent effects across different labs and replications, with overall odds against chance exceeding 1,000,000 to 1.
1,000,000 to 1. That's incredible. So it's like there's some invisible connection between people, even when they're physically separated.
It's a possibility that the research raises.
And do you think these effects might be stronger when there's a lot of collective focus or heightened emotional energy, like during a big sporting event or a natural disaster?
That's a really interesting question, and some researchers have looked into that. They've studied the output of random number generators during events like the Academy Awards ceremony.
Okay.
And some of the findings suggest that there might be correlations between moments of high audience engagement and increased fluctuations in the RNGs.
So it's like our collective attention might be having a subtle effect on these random systems.
That's an intriguing idea.
It is. And speaking of large-scale randomness, what about casinos? They're basically giant generators of random events.
Right. Radin actually describes casinos as natural psi labs because of all the gambling that goes on.
Yeah.
And he points out that while the total amount of money wagered follows predictable patterns, the daily payout percentages, which are based on chance, shouldn't show any systematic dependence on how much money is being bet.
Okay.
So if psi is real, you might expect to see some non-random fluctuations in those daily payout percentages.
Like maybe gamblers are subtly influencing the roulette wheel or the slot machines.
Yeah, something like that.
Has anyone actually studied this?
Yes. Radin mentions one study that looked at potential correlations between lunar cycles, geomagnetic activity, and casino payout percentages.
Okay.
The idea was that maybe variations in geomagnetic activity could influence psychic abilities, which in turn could affect the gambling outcomes.
Interesting. So did they find anything?
The results were complex. The study didn't find a clear, consistent link between lunar cycles, geomagnetic field strength, and overall casino payouts.
Okay.
But even the fact that they were looking for these subtle connections in a system as chaotic as a casino shows how creative researchers are getting in trying to find real-world evidence for psi.
Right. It's like they're looking for needles in a haystack.
Exactly.
So after looking at all this research, what are your thoughts on the reality of psyche? Do you think it's real?
Well, Radin makes a really important point. He says that most parapsychologists aren't primarily focused on explaining what psi is in some fundamental sense.
Okay.
Their main goal is to scientifically test the types of experiences that people have been reporting for centuries. So if well-designed experiments that are trying to investigate things like telepathy or precognition produce results that match those real-life experiences, then that suggests that maybe those experiences are more than just coincidence or wishful thinking.
Regardless of whether we fully understand the underlying mechanism.
Exactly.
And how do you respond to the argument that after 100 years of research, psi is still a century of failure?
Radin has a clever counter to that. He points out that mainstream psychology, after a similar amount of time, still doesn't have definitive answers to fundamental questions about things like consciousness, memory, learning, and perception.
Yeah.
So if you apply the same level of skepticism to psychology that's often directed at psi research, you could say that psychology is also a failure.
Right. It just highlights how complex these fields are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with things like consciousness and subjective experience.
And of course, you can't talk about psi without mentioning the skeptics, the people who offer alternative explanations for the findings.
Right. And Radin introduces some of the key figures in psi skepticism, like Price and Hensel, who often focused on fraud and methodological flaws as explanations for positive psi results.
Okay.
They basically started with the assumption that ESP was impossible, and therefore any positive results must be due to cheating or mistakes.
Right. So they were already coming in with a strong bias.
They were, and that kind of skepticism has definitely shaped the field of parapsychology.
And have they specifically targeted certain areas of research for criticism?
They have. For example, some skeptics, like Zusne and Jones, try to explain away the positive findings in dream telepathy studies by saying that maybe the recipients were accidentally primed with information about the target before they went to sleep.
Okay.
But Radin points out that these interpretations were often based on misunderstandings of the actual experimental procedures.
So the skeptics were sometimes wrong about the details of the research.
Yeah, and it shows how our beliefs can really distort our perception of the evidence.
Right. We see what we want to see.
Exactly. And Radin talks about how our minds are like story generators. We're constantly constructing mental models of the world based on our expectations, biases, and desires.
So we're not just passively observing reality. We're actively shaping it with our minds.
Right. And that applies to both believers and skeptics. We all have a tendency to filter information in a way that confirms what we already think.
And that makes it really hard to change people's minds, even when presented with strong evidence.
It does. And Radin uses a great historical example to illustrate this point, the theory of continental drift.
Oh yeah, Alfred Wegener, the guy who said that the continents were once all joined together.
Exactly. And at the time, that was a radical idea. It went against the prevailing scientific worldview, and it was ridiculed for decades.
Even though Wegener had a lot of evidence to support his theory.
He did, but it just didn't fit with what people already believed, so it took a long time for the scientific community to accept it.
It's a good reminder that even the most well-established scientific theories can be wrong, and that sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas are the ones that challenge our assumptions the most.
Exactly.
And nowadays, a lot of what we learn about science comes from the media, which has its own biases and agendas.
That's right. Radin talks about how most of what we know about psi research is filtered through things like TV shows, magazines, and books.
Yeah.
And those media outlets have their own incentives. You know, they want to tell a good story, they want to get ratings or sell copies.
Right, so they might sensationalize the findings or present them in a way that's misleading.
Exactly. And that can have a big impact on how the public perceives the research.
Yeah, I think we've all seen examples of that, where the media takes a complex scientific study and boils it down to a catchy headline that doesn't really capture the nuances.
Right.
It seems like there's also this historical division in Western thought between the hard sciences, which focus on objective, measurable stuff, and the more subjective aspects of human experience where psi seems to reside.
That's a key point. Radin talks about how the rise of modern science led to this disenchantment of nature.
Okay.
The pre-modern worldview saw the world as full of meaning and interconnectedness. But then we started to see this split between the objective world of matter, which science could study, and the subjective world of personal experience, which was seen as more the realm of philosophy or religion.
Okay, so we created this artificial separation between mind and matter.
Yeah, and that made it really difficult for mainstream science to take psi seriously because psi seems to blur those boundaries.
Right. It suggests that maybe mind and matter aren't as separate as we thought they were.
Exactly.
Are there any emerging scientific concepts that might offer a new way to think about this interconnectedness?
There are, Radin mentions the idea of downward causation.
Downward causation, what's that?
It's the idea that causal influences can flow not just from lower levels of organization to higher levels, but also the other way around.
Okay, you give an example.
Sure. So in biology, we usually think about causation going from atoms to molecules to cells to organs to organisms. But downward causation suggests that maybe the mind, which is at a higher level of organization, can also influence those lower levels.
Okay, so it's like our thoughts and intentions can have a real impact on our physical bodies.
Yeah, that's the idea. And it could potentially explain things like the placebo effect or even mind-matter interaction.
And quantum physics has also challenged our traditional ideas about the separation between mind and matter.
Absolutely. Quantum theory, with its emphasis on the observer effect and the interconnectedness of things, really shook up the classical Newtonian view of the world.
Yeah, in quantum physics, it seems like the act of observation actually plays a role in shaping reality.
Right. And that's led some physicists to suggest that maybe the universe is more mind-like than we previously thought.
So maybe consciousness is more fundamental than we realized.
It's a fascinating possibility.
So where do we go from here? Is there a theory of psi on the horizon that can explain all this?
Radin says that a good theory of psi would have to be compatible with what we already know from physics, psychology, and neuroscience, but it would also have to explain the anomalous findings that don't fit with our current paradigms.
Right. It's got to be able to explain both the normal and the paranormal.
Exactly. And he suggests systems theory as a potential starting point for developing a more holistic understanding of these phenomena.
Systems theory.
Yeah, it's a way of looking at complex systems as a whole rather than just focusing on the individual parts.
Okay.
And it might be helpful for understanding how psi fits into the bigger picture of reality.
What about those more extraordinary claims like apparitions, hauntings, and out-of-body experiences? Does Reagan address those in the book?
He does acknowledge them, but he says he chose not to focus on them in detail.
Okay, why not?
Mainly because the evidence for those types of phenomena is mostly anecdotal. It comes from spontaneous experiences that are hard to control or replicate in a lab.
Yeah, it's tough to design a scientific experiment to study a ghost.
Right, and it's